Okay. Well, it is 6:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out for our fourth seminar on evaluating the news. Now, as I mentioned in previous seminars, I don't like to end on a doom and gloom kind of note, and so we're going to start to see the upside tonight. We've looked at plenty of bad examples, and we will still see some more bad examples today, unfortunately. But we'll also start to see the good work that people can do. So, before we begin, imagine that you're a trained spy, given the mission of securing information from a criminal organization that, if obtained, would successfully lead to their prosecution. So, we're having an imagination exercise. What are your objectives? Stay safe. Okay, all right. How do you obtain your information?
People on the street, people in that organization.
How do you verify the information you receive isn't fake? If they're feeding you false info because they know that your cover's blown, but you don't know it. And how do you deal with the pressure of the mission and the threat of hostile entities? Okay? So, what does this have to do with evaluating news? Welcome to the work, sometimes, of a 21st century journalist. It can be dangerous work. It can definitely be hostile work. And we're going to take a deeper look at that today. And so our topics of discussion for today are first, what is journalism? And how is it different from news media? What are the standard ethics of journalism? It's a very good topic. How have news media companies, social media companies, and the 24/7 news cycle impacted journalism? And what are some examples of journalism, both good and bad? And so we're going to take a look at those. So we're going to cover some journalism basics. And there are four main points of the journalism process. First is collecting information. You're finding sources and you're verifying those sources, and you're verifying the source's information whenever possible. Okay, so it's a fact-finding mission. Second is writing. Journalism involves recording collected information to remember and share it. So it's not just hearsay, but you're actually documenting what you have found. Then comes editing, and you're organizing and verifying information, again, to present to an audience. There's more information than we can ever absorb or collect, and so editing has to take place in order for you to think about what are the main facts that people need to know. And then there's presenting. And so sharing information that's been collected, verified, and organized for presentation in an understandable way. If you're not sharing it in a way that will reach people or that they're going to understand, then you're wasting your time. News media, on the other hand, okay, is it going to be a little slow on me? We'll see. There we go. Are companies that control and build means to disseminate information in print, online and through social media, over radio, on television, and through advertising as well. They provide consistent messaging through different outlets. And so you'll see that if a company owns a number of media outlets, you will even hear presenters using the same phrases and same words to describe things. Remember a couple seminars ago when we saw the words fiery speech, referring to President Biden's address to Congress. They can be for-profit. They can also be not-for-profit, or they can be government-controlled, because remember, news media doesn't just exist here in the United States, it exists across the world. So today we will actually look at a couple examples of state-controlled media. And how very different it can be. News media companies have conflicting purposes. So on the one hand, they employ journalists to do those four things we just looked at. But on the other hand, they want to continue to run. and in order to continue to run, they need funding. And so they're kind of like insurance companies in that respect, is that they're there to provide benefits to the public, but they also have to somehow manage funding and shareholders in that regard. And it's highly competitive. Funding is often based on audience size and spread or by subscription, so there's pressure to attract and get people's attention. And so the way these news media companies are structured has an impact on journalists who are just trying to share information. And so how do we ensure that this doesn't taint that journalism process? And so that's where we get into the ethics of journalism. And so first we'll take a look at the Society of Professional Journalists. And there are 4 main tenets of the ethics of journalism. Number 1, seek truth and report it. Number 2, minimize harm. Number 3, act independently. And number 4, be accountable and transparent. Now, I can already hear the wheels turning a little bit. Like, that doesn't sound like a lot of news I've been seeing, right? And that's because oftentimes the news media companies, because they control those avenues of information dispersion, they get to select, remember, as gatekeepers, what it is that you're able to access. The internet gives us some ways to bypass that, and I'm going to show you some good examples there as we get into that. But to review those again, seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent. And we will look at good and bad examples of this later. Next is the International Federation of Journalists. Also have some guidelines for us. So the Global Charter of Ethics for Journalists. 1, respect the facts and for the right of the public to truth is the first duty of the journalist. 2, in pursuance of this duty, the journalist shall at all times defend the principles of freedom in the honest collection and publication of news and of the right of fair comment and criticism, and will make sure to clearly distinguish factual information from commentary and criticism. So again, that gets blurred a lot with news media companies, right? And there are a number of other things in this list, and it's all available online, but in the interest of time, we're not going to read through all 16 tenets here. But they are good to consider when you are evaluating a news source. Next, the International Journalists Association. And taking a look here at media ethics. So the International Journalists Association keeps track of ethics in media in terms of where things are getting censored, what is getting censored, and how journalists are being blocked from doing their job in collecting and sharing information. And so if we look here, scroll down a little bit, you can see various articles that are talking about journalists that have been threatened, that have been arrested in different countries, that have been ejected from countries. And so there's some interesting things that you can see there. And then the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the Icij. They do fantastic work. So this is just their homepage. And so these are the journalists that work together across the world to uncover all the things that people don't want found. And so they do amazing work, and we're going to look at some examples of their work later. And many of them do things that, you know, if they were discovered, like in our imagination example at the beginning, they could be killed. And that's not a good thing. So we looked at those principles and some standards. What are some bad examples in the last few years where those standards were not followed? So we're going to look at 2 examples. And the first one is the Steele Dossier. This was put forward during the 2016 election campaign, and it resulted in a lot of media coverage, right? But they didn't verify the sources, and they didn't verify the information, and it resulted in 3 years of congressional inquiry and $32 million of taxpayer money spent just on the direct investigation by Congress. That's not counting the money spent by the FBI and the CIA and the lawyers and everything else, all of that taxpayer money. And it was found to be able to not be verifiable, and some parts of it just made up. So that's bad journalism. It was put forward because it was a hot issue, it could generate a lot of money, but it wasn't factual and it caused a lot of problems. The next example, how many of you have heard of this young man, Nick Sandman? Okay, so a whole bunch of news networks, after a video was released of him while he was on the National Mall near the Lincoln Memorial, jumped on and began attacking this young man and saying all sorts of horrible things about him, and they failed to verify the context. When the full video was found that showed that, in fact, what they were saying was completely untrue, on top of that, they refused to publicly retract the horrible things that they said, and he has now had $860 million of defamation settlements and counting from news networks. So just because you think something will fit into a news item of the day, or it fits the narrative that you're trying to tell, if you do not follow those principles and verify your sources in those basic steps of journalism, it's going to result in big problems that make you look very embarrassed and sometimes cost people their jobs. So you can't just throw stuff out there because you're excited about it. What about good examples in the last few years? So let's look at some good things that were done. I talked about the investigative journalists. So how many of you heard of the Panama and the Pandora Papers?
I don't remember what they were, but...
Okay. So through investigations and verifying of information for over a year before publication. So there were hundreds of journalists across the world who received information from a source, and they spent over a year verifying all of that information before they published it. And when they published it, the repercussions of that are still being felt, because these 2 investigations have turned up how rich and powerful people are taking other people's money, involved in corruption and other things like that, and how they're also hiding their money to avoid paying taxes and things like that. And so it's caused a number of political leaders to resign. It's caused embarrassment for some celebrities. And it's also helped to uncover links with organized crime, drug cartels and things like that in a number of countries, as well as art theft and things like that. And so taking the time to verify the sources and getting it right, and then coming forward so that there is no question that these things can be documented and are true, that's the way to do it. And that's despite the threat of political and economic pressure, is because they investigated everything beforehand when it was all released, even though there were some very angry people with a lot of money, they could not stop it because of the internet. And so it's been a good check, you could say. And then also, I want to bring attention to the reporting of human rights and war crimes. The U.S. media doesn't cover this a lot, but there are parts of the world where terrible things are happening, and there are political organizations and terrorist organizations and military organizations that are getting away with doing terrible things and not being held to account, Now, there is always the question internationally of, well, who's going to hold them accountable? But we can't stop things like that from happening or do something about it unless we actually know that it's happening. And so I have a list of some of those places here in the last couple of years. So Sudan, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Myanmar, China, and also here in the United States it happens, right? And so all of these are things that journalists often at either the risk of their job or the risk of their life go out and report on because they know it's important for people to know what's going on. And it used to be when there were rules of engagement back before September 11th, 2001, that journalists were exempted from combat action. You know, journalists were often, they were specially identified and they didn't get caught in the crossfire or taken captive. That's not so anymore. In a lot of places, Syria being a prime example, journalists are often caught in the crossfire and killed. So now let's talk about the 24/7 news cycle. We took a look at structure of media companies a little bit, and so let's see how this is affecting things. With the 24/7 news cycle, there's always a sense of immediacy, right? And because of that, whoever gets the story out first gets the most views. And if you get a scoop or an exclusive, you're making more money, right? Easy sharing of information means three things, though. Number one, once you release it, it's out there forever. You can't get it back. Someone somewhere can save it and store it, and you have no way to stop them from doing that. Number two, if you make a mistake, it's very hard to let everyone who read the original know. And we talked about that last week as well, is that if you don't do your verifying and checking of things, then when you find out that there's an error or a mistake, sometimes your follow-up isn't as widely covered as the original. Right? Mm-hmm. It's easier for others to copy, to alter, to take out of context, or to notice mistakes. And when I say notice mistakes, that means that other people know about those mistakes a lot quicker too. Whereas if a newspaper had an error in their print edition, someone had to contact the newspaper, and then the newspaper would issue either an editorial update or a retraction of some kind in the next edition of the paper, right? Well, now you have billions of people online, and if you have just thousands of people all reading the document, chances are if there's a mistake, somebody's going to spot it. And if they share it because either they think it's funny or they're upset by that mistake, then you're in a position of embarrassment there. But because of that sense of immediacy and something always coming up, it shortens people's attention span for a news story because there's always more coming out. There's always something else. And so you need news stories all the time. And it creates a self-perpetuating problem of, if you're always trying to get a news story, then you don't have or take the time to verify information, so you're making mistakes, and it just keeps going. And so I wanted to stop a bit and talk about a book, Fahrenheit 451. How many of you have read that? Okay, now normally when people talk about Fahrenheit 451, they talk about the main aspect of the plot, which is the temperature that books are burned at, and the censorship of written information. But what I'd like to draw attention to here is the main character's wife and what she does all day. If any of you recall in the story, she has this amazing room that has 3D wall-to-wall hollow projection of just stuff all day long. And that's her entire life, to the point where she can't even remember where she met her husband, and he can't remember either. But a 24/7 news cycle, if we're always being presented with new content, it's easy to be entertained, but it's a lot harder to think. Okay, so next we're going to talk a little bit about freedom of the press. And so first I want to ask, why is this important? What do you think?
Because the government doesn't control it.
Okay, so that the government doesn't control it, okay, and did you say security?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I'm thinking of Kovitz and how China kind of covered it up and didn't report it properly.
Okay, so
It's just a disaster.
it prevents the suppression of information. Okay, all right. A controlled press is propaganda, right? An unethical press is just sensational. And for people to be informed, they need reliable information. And reliable information requires journalism for sharing widely. And for journalism, it requires those ethics to be considered reliable. So what's the state of freedom of the press today? Now, we looked at last week Reporters Without Borders and their listing of freedom of the press and how the United States was down at number 44, not even in the top 10. So in the United States, there's government intervention, there's corporate intervention. Those are things that are affecting the ability of information to be shared and expressed. Around the world, let's take a look. Okay, so back to the International Federation of Journalists. And they have a Human Rights Day. And so 2021, so last year, and this was a report authored on December 10th. 45 journalists were killed, and there are 365 in prison across the world. So let's take a look at where those are. Here's our nice handy map. Okay, so 2 journalists in the Americas, all right. 87 journalists in Europe are in prison. 68 in the Middle East, 46 in Africa, 162 in Asia and the Pacific. I'll have you guess which 2 countries have the majority of those. All right. And so then moving down, we'll take a look at where journalists were killed last year. 2 were accidental deaths while they were, pursuing information. 10 happened here in the Americas, 6 in Europe, 3 in the Middle East, 8 in Africa, and 20 in Asia and the Pacific. Yes?
How does it compare like 10 years ago?
That's a good question, and you can go back and look through their posts, and they do offer a little bit of comparison. So in 2020, 65 were killed, and so last year wasn't as bad for journalists in that respect. But of these 45, 33 were murdered in targeted attacks. So think about that for a minute. That's 11/15. That's over 2/3 of the reasons why journalists were killed, not because it was they were caught in a bad situation or something spontaneously happened, but they were targeted specifically and killed. 9 were killed in Afghanistan, making it the most dangerous country for journalists in 2021. So, last year was a bad year for Afghanistan.
Do you know the status of the Chinese gal that was on a hunger strike since May?
I have not heard a specific update. We're going to look at the People's Daily, and I'm pretty sure they will not talk about it.
Does not exist.
Nope, it does not exist. So I want you to think, we've talked about yellow journalism, that sensationalism, big flashy headlines and things, and the 24 news cycle. How do those affect freedom of the press? Yes?
Well, it puts them in unattainable position at times. I mean, you can't possibly get this information when somebody has taken a scoop out from under and hasn't researched it well enough. So I mean, you're done before you start.
Okay, that is one very good point. Any other thoughts?
I think as a new article comes out, it varies what might be important.
Okay, there's just so much flow that information that might actually, you might find interesting or important or care about gets lost in the flow, right? Another thing to consider, especially with what we just looked at, is governments use this as an excuse to censor. Say they're not real professionals. They're just saying all sorts of crazy things and making false statements, and there's so much information out there that we have to be in control and make sure that things aren't getting out of hand.
What's the definition of yellow journalism?
So yellow journalism is a term that came about due to the newspaper wars between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst in the 1880s and 1890s. It started with Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper. There was a comic artist that he employed, and the term came about. It's a racist term because of the depictions in those comics that were used as propaganda for certain elements in the U.S. government to help push public opinion to allow for the U.S. to go to war with Spain. And so big flashy headlines, very emotional language, shock and outrage. So, good question. How do social media companies affect freedom of the press? Well, that sounded not so positive. What do you think?
It is not.
They can censor the information.
They can censor information, right? And so I specifically said not social media as an idea or a concept, but social media companies. Is because it's a private platform, they can decide what gets posted on there, right?
Fact checkers.
And we talked about that a couple weeks ago. So, what is the biggest weapon used to silence journalists today in countries that claim free speech? So I'm not talking about in oppressive regimes or war-torn countries, but in countries like the United States, what is the biggest weapon used to silence journalists?
Advertising. Cancel culture. I would say.
Okay, some good ideas. Now remember, we looked at with the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers, is there are a lot of very rich people that think that because they have money that they are above the law, or that certain laws don't apply to them. You may have heard the quote that as soon as the punishment for a law is a fine, then it is a law that only applies to the poor. And so those are things to consider. And so what is it that they can do to try to silence journalists? Repeated legal action. Sue, litigate, press charges. And they do this all the time. You know, journalists, most of the journalists that end up in prison you looked at in Europe, a surprising amount of journalists in prison, they're not just put in there by the state police or the secret police or something like that. No, they were arrested and sent to prison. And they do this because they can strain the financial resources of the journalist, right? They can restrict or stop publication of what the journalist is trying to share, or restrict or incarcerate the journalist. They can promote fear of reprisal, making an example of somebody, right, so that other journalists are afraid to share what they know. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's exactly that. And they can also attempt to discredit a journalist's work by ad hominem and genetic fallacies. So journalist gets arrested, and then they say, well, this guy must have done something bad, so don't believe anything he says, right?
How many journalists are in jail because they won't give up their sources?
Their sources? That's a very good question, and I'd like to see that data as well. And we're going to take a look at some whistleblower things here in the next little bit. But first, let's talk about the structure of social media companies. because again, they have an impact on journalism today. One of the problems with social media companies is they're complex entities, both in structure and legally, which is what makes it difficult to deal with them in terms of freedom of the press. Because on the one hand, they are forums, right, where information is shared. On the other hand, they are content creators and moderators. In another sense, they are communication tools. And yet, in another sense, they are technology companies. And so you have all these different aspects of social media companies that can make it a very sticky wicket in figuring out what they can and cannot do. And of course, there are certainly accusations and possibly evidence that some of these companies push that to see what they can get away with. What else? Think of anything else that might define a social media company? Advertising, okay. And we'll look at that too. So that comes down to how should they be classified? Should they be considered a corporate entity, a technology company? Should they be considered a public forum for people to share and discuss information? Should they be considered a communication provider, like your phone service or your internet provider? And all of these confusions lead to problems with regulation. How many times in the last few years have social media CEOs been brought before Congress to answer questions because things don't add up? These conflicting roles lead to ambiguous accountability, right? Is people are using their services and they're doing things, but in what way are they accountable for what is on their platform or not on their platform, right? The other problem is that their international presence means they can alter their rules from country to country. There are lots of examples in the last several years of things that were available here in the United States being suppressed in other countries, and the social media companies voluntarily complying with those governments to suppress that information. And so think about that. Last week we talked about gatekeepers and censorship, and they are complicit in that. But in their defense, right, it's difficult to have oversight because of the way they are structured. There are always more users than staff, right? You can only have so many people working for the company, and they can only work so many hours in a day, and mentally and emotionally and psychologically, you can only review certain kinds of content for so long before you cannot anymore. And artificial intelligence and algorithms aren't sophisticated enough to evaluate all the methods of human expression. They can be taught to identify words or phrases. They can be taught to identify certain elements in images or the source of a video link, but they are not as sophisticated as the way that you and I can communicate. And so they will flag things that shouldn't be, and they will miss lots of things that should be stopped. And that leads us to our next point, trying to balance freedom of expression with stopping criminal, dangerous, or false content. And that's a difficult place to put a private company in, right? But because they are forums, because they are communication tools, criminals use them, right? And it's a frustrating problem. Right? And there are
similar situation.
And there are different analogies that go with that. But to counter that analogy is after the manufacturer makes the firearm and sells it to you, the manufacturer doesn't come and check on you using your firearm every day. No. And so that constant presence of the company creates a bit of a different legal situation. No analogy is perfect. Unfortunately, as technology advances, new problems come up. So let's take a short look at comparing news media companies versus social media companies in terms of structure and the way that they do things. So news media companies have various channels of communication, whereas social media has online content. News media presenters give approved content, and on social media, anyone making content, but it needs to be approved. News media targets an audience, whereas social media is shared individually and collectively. News media has a company that makes money by having an audience, and social media as a company makes money by having users. Similar. News media, as we mentioned, has consistent messaging and perspectives. And social media has a wide variety of conflicting messages and perspectives. News media has predominantly passive content, right? It's meant to be viewed or listened to or read, whereas social media has interactive content. People are trying to get you to share or comment or like or respond in some way, and those interactions generate money. News media companies start from a common source, whereas social media companies, social media content starts from individual sources. Now, that distinction is, news media reporters would say, for example, at a White House press conference. They are all there. They are all asking questions to the same person. They all have access to what that person is saying. Whereas on social media, someone in the White House could take a picture of something that those journalists don't have access to and post it on social media, right? And so that's a difference, is news media companies oftentimes have a very structured venue or position from which they tell a story, whereas in social media, anybody can pop something on there. News media companies have gatekeeping and censorship by omission. It's the stories they don't tell or that they overlook or choose not to share that gets things censored. Whereas on social media, they have gatekeeping and censorship by restriction. Is if something gets shared, they might delete it or restrict it, or they may even ban a user, right? All of those are things that social media companies can do to gatekeep and censor. News media companies are inhibited by corporate bureaucracy, right? It makes it harder for journalists to do their jobs because of those conflicting priorities. Social media are restricted by corporate organization. The complex nature of what they do and the fact that there's always more users than staff means that what they can do in terms of everything else is restricted by how they're structured, what they've got asset-wise. News media has scripted interactions. If someone goes onto a news program to be interviewed, oftentimes the questions are pre-approved, or other times, at least the presenter has certain questions or topics in mind. Whereas on social media, anybody can talk about anything, right? And they frequently do. And so a few questions, how are they similar? Well, they're both gatekeepers, right? They both are presenting content and trying to reach audiences in a way. And how are they different? A number of different ways. So what happens when they work together? Because news media are private companies, right? And social media are private companies. So what happens when they work together? Good things, bad things?
You might not want to work together, and they're a monolith.
Yeah.
They could do both. Depends upon their ethics on both sides.
Exactly. It can depend on their ethics, and it can depend on why they're working together. Yeah. And what happens when they have conflict? And that conflict can come for a variety of reasons. It can come because of investment issues. It can come from content or coverage issues or vying for audience. Those are all things that can come into play in conflict. So there's all these different entities, and they're all influencing journalists trying to share information. Journalists are trying to get the word out, and so they're trying to use different means to get the word out, but yet they have to navigate and juggle all of this. And so, is it enhancing or toxic? Let's think about it for a bit. How does the 24/7 news cycle impact the decisions that journalists make? About how much time to spend on a story, right? Or about what to cover. We've talked about that. Or about how to present a story, right? If your editor says, I need you to collect information on this topic that can be presented in a 5-minute segment, that restricts what you can put together, doesn't it? That's why I remember that the Society of Professional Journalists, their third ethical point was act independently, right?
I think a lot of times news, the 24/7 news, they get press releases from whoever wants the story out there, and then they just go with it because they don't have time or money or resources to really investigate it, or they don't want to be late because they pass that press release out to everybody.
It creates a lot of pressure. Yep. Does it affect word choice?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. So how does a news media company environment impact the effectiveness of a journalist? Let's take a look at some bad examples. So first up is blatant copying and plagiarism. So iMedia Ethics, they investigate media outlets and reporting to look for examples of people not following journalistic ethics. Okay, so the New York Times August editor's note revealed that the Times had quoted 2 lawyers for Iron Brotherhood gang leader Barry Mills who were not his lawyers and probably not even real people. Sometimes, people didn't attribute its sources. Okay, there we go. The Daily Beast Lizzie Crocker resigned in January, and the news site deleted several of her articles. They said in a statement that she had plagiarized. And so that pressure gets to people. They don't have time to write the article, so they just borrow somebody else's words, right? Or they make it up.
Fabrication.
Right.
Make it up.
Resignations. There we go. Okay, there we go. So this is from The Guardian. Der Spiegel is one of the main newspapers in Germany. So Klaus Relotius was a very well-known journalist. He even earned some awards, and it turned out that many of the news articles he wrote were completely fabricated. So he had won some Journalist of the Year awards and whatnot. So here's one paragraph. Juan Moreno eventually tracked down 2 alleged sources quoted extensively by Relotius in the article. Both said they'd never met him. And he'd also lied about seeing a hand-painted sign that read Mexicans keep out. That's referring to a particular. They said, okay, let's see if it gives us a figure here. Maybe not, but there we go. In at least 14 out of 60 articles that he had made up stories or invented protagonists. So almost a quarter of everything he wrote was made up.
And he's only 33 years old. That's pretty
Right.
good stuff.
Right?
What is the editor's job?
Oh, and that's a good question. For news media companies, the editor is supposed to be a second layer of verification and checking, to ask the tough questions. But especially in the last couple years with the news, the 24/7 news cycle, we've seen that it's very much become a shoot first, ask questions later, and put out an editorial note. Oops, oops, oops. And unfortunately, for people that are paying attention, it makes them look really bad.
But see, I think it makes newspapers look bad,
Hmm.
but then social media doesn't look bad because they don't have to prove it.
Yeah, they don't have
And
to
that
say, "I'm
comes into
sorry."
that complex question of accountability and legalness. Okay, so let's take a look at
Yeah.
corporate pressure.
Later.
Okay. So during his 10 months at the Akron Beacon Journal, reporter Mark Schlube didn't get to do the kind of writing that generally gets picked up by the national media. He got pink-slipped, and he got really irritated and kind of expressed himself emotionally. "You corporate hacks take a break from your golf game long enough to scream that circulation must stay up, but then you order arbitrary budget cuts. And when that's not enough, you order layoffs that eliminate the very employees who have helped keep circulation from falling. What kind of witless dolt are you? Seriously, the kid who changes the oil in my car could run the newspaper with more foresight than you." And the article goes on and says, now that's the kind of writing that gets noticed. It said that he became a minor celebrity because his boss has become a lightning rod for journalists who argue that Wall Street is ruining their profession, that corporate interest, shareholders, investment, money, making money, is making it harder for journalists to do their job, right? That corporate structure. Okay, Gamergate. How many of you have heard of Gamergate? Okay, one person. Okay. So a number of years ago, probably around, I want to say 2014, there was a video game reporter, a woman who wrote a glowing review about a game that had come out. And the people who had played the game said, "What? It's a terrible game. Nobody liked it." And so they independently investigated and found that the game was made by this woman's ex-boyfriend. But why is this a bad example? Well, not just because it was showing the relationship between video game companies and these news media companies, but unfortunately, the gamers on there went beyond what they should have. And it resulted in a bunch of online harassment and threats and things like that. And so it's a bad example on both sides, is that the journalists, did a shady deal, but then on the other side, it made it more difficult for journalists to do their job to find out what was going on because of all of the online hate that was happening. And the link there just goes to a broad definition there. So let's look at some good examples. We go. The Me Too movement, where journalists held people with money and power to account and said, there are stories that need to be told, and you can't just sweep it under the rug. And along that same line, Jeffrey Epstein, right? And all the people that he was connected to, and how the media is covering or not covering it. There's lots of things that can be said there. But again, holding people to account for what happened there. Natural disaster relief. So going to take a look at some government guidelines here from the CDC. One of your most important communication partners during an emergency is the media. Don't be nervous to work with the media. The media serves as an emergency broadcast system to get vital information to the people who need it most. It can be a useful tool when, bad things are happening. Revealing government corruption. And so the AP issued anniversary article in which they reprinted the original from 1972, in which the Associated Press's Gene Heller revealed the Tuskegee experiment, right? And that for years, 40 years, on taxpayer money, they had done this horrible thing to these men. And if it can go on that long without people realizing what's happening, then it raises questions about what else is going on. And so again, it just brings up the importance of ethical journalists who will seek out information and share it with the public to stop things like this from happening. Yeah. Okay, grassroots news media. So, news media companies, corporate entities, lots of money, whole bunch of different channels. But thanks to the internet and things like crowdsource funding and whatnot, there are small websites and companies that are going out there and are trying to be ethical journalists and sharing the stories that governments and big companies don't want to be told. So first, Mint Press News. Mint Press News is an independent watchdog journalism organization that provides issue-based original reporting, in-depth investigations, and thoughtful analysis of the most pressing topics facing our nation. We focus our coverage on issues relating to the effects of special interest groups, big business and lobbying efforts, and how they shape policies at home and abroad, including American foreign policy. Through the lens of social justice and human rights, we report on how these dynamics drive our foreign affairs and impact the world, and examine the effects they have on our democracy and freedoms as defined by the Constitution. And so if we go down here, they're always looking for funding to help them do what they're doing. But you notice their last line here, Mint Press is tenaciously committed to total editorial freedom and journalistic integrity. And so the line above that, we are committed to rejecting any funding source that attempts to influence what we report on and how we do so. Shadowproof. So is it not gonna let me connect? Yeah, it's not liking me. No, it's not gonna let me connect. They're a UK-based organization that also, they focus on government accountability and especially efforts of government to silence journalists. So they focus on when the government tries to censor people from sharing stories and making sure those stories get told. And then Project Veritas. Anyone heard of them?
Yeah.
Okay. Right? There are lots of news media companies that do not like them and give all sorts of negative reporting of them. Some of the times it's because they got the story first, and other times because it's revealing things that they don't want shared, right? And so Project Veritas is constantly involved in litigation. They are getting sued and having district attorneys sent after them all the time. They have yet to lose a court case. And so that's something to be said there.
Where do they come from?
It started with one young man, James, I'm forgetting his last name. O'Keefe, yes, yeah, James O'Keefe. And it's grown since then quite a bit. And they, let's click on their page because it'll show.
In the United States?
In the United States, yes. Okay. He established it in 2011 as a nonprofit journalism enterprise to continue undercover reporting. It investigates and exposes corruption, dishonesty, self-dealing, waste, fraud, and other misconduct in both public and private institutions to achieve a more ethical and transparent society. And so if we come down here, right about there. Okay. Journalists working undercover on their own or by, with, and through idealistic insiders bring to the American people the corrupt private truths hidden behind the walls of their institutions. Throughout this website, there are in-depth and honest discussions of their successes, any mistakes, and also bad things that people say about them. Mostly, they're stories about successful impacts the organization has led at the local, state, and national levels. They've affected legislation. They've affected, company CEOs and a number of other things because of what they have brought to the public's attention that people were trying to keep hidden. Okay. So now we get to our case studies. All right. And wouldn't you know it, we're almost out of time again. So since we missed looking at them last week, let's take a look at some of these. So USA Today. Okay. Subscribe. Money, headers, advertising, right? Okay. So this is given the heading of politics. So 24/7 news cycle, right? It's given the heading of politics. Sarah Palin eats at NYC restaurant days after positive COVID-19 tests. Okay. Should this be national news? I mean, objectively, is she involved in national politics right now? No, right? And so maybe people in New York care about that. Maybe her family cares about that, but why should we care, right?
She's a celebrity now.
Right? And so celebrity coverage, entertainment, right?
It's like AOC down in Florida.
Yep. Better trained, better equipped, a look at Russia and Ukraine's militaries. And you'll notice here, 4 subscribers, meaning gatekeeping. We can't access it unless we pay the money. We're going to take a look because this topic is going to show up over and over. It's a really big topic in the news right now. But you are going to see a lot of different perspectives. So here we go. Next up is the BBC. So the British Broadcasting Corporation. And here we've got pipeline won't open if Russia invades Ukraine, U.S. says. And so we've got a bunch of different things here. And so you see they're covering things from a lot of different places. Right. Next up, Al Jazeera. Notice how they all have pop-ups saying, you can trust us, right? Yeah, I'll trust you to try to take my data unless I tell you no. Okay, all right, there we go. All right. Okay, we've got Ukraine, to war or not to war. Now, they do label it here, opinion, right? Yeah. Next to it, Ukraine crisis, from Belarus to Japan, where do countries stand? Russians hope for peace as the world talks of war. That's a very interesting article, by the way. They went and interviewed a bunch of regular Russian people that said, we don't want to go to war. Perspectives. The Times of India. And this is the U.S. edition. So very news media structured, yes. So U.S. news here, Ukraine tension among other issues on table as Biden hosts German chancellor. Okay. The People's Daily, my favorite. This is a state-run newspaper. I'm going to X you because I am not agreeing to your privacy policy. She extends Spring Festival greetings to all Chinese people during Shanxi visit. U.S. Feds, it will soon be appropriate to raise interest rates amid surging inflation. China urges U.S. to correct wrongdoings in, let's see what it says there, trade practices following WTO ruling. Meddling in Taiwan will bring U.S.-Japan greater suffering. Okay.
But you said this is the U.S. version. You don't know.
That's the English version. But the Chinese version says the same thing.
Oh, you think
So I read Chinese, so yeah. Okay, the Santiago Times,
Everybody does.
which is one of the big newspapers in Chile, in South America. This is the English edition. Chile to open borders for vaccinated nationals. The Russian COVID vaccine cleared to land in Chile. Economic news, human rights. Economy, Argentina. So, yep. It's interesting how you're seeing a wide variety of what different places consider news and have as their headlines. Right. The Standard, which is one of the large newspapers in Kenya. Mhm. Okay. See, it's mostly national and structured news, right?
What they need you to know.
Mm-hmm. And the Moscow Times.
Nothing about the new general manager for the licensing.
No. No. No positive response from U.S. on main Ukraine demand, says Russia.
Yeah.
It's a very different perspective, isn't it? Right?
Oh, yeah. Surprised there's not a tank in it. Drills off Irish coast.
Yep. U.S. teacher held in Russia for large-scale drug smuggling.
Yeah.
Well, it could be true. You'd have to investigate it, right? Well, it's better to be arrested in Russia than to be executed in China. Drug smuggling is a capital offense. Yep. Okay. So, again, we're out of time, but you can see that people around the world care about a lot of different things, and companies around the world structure the way they share information in a similar way online, but what they think is important is different, because they're all gatekeepers, right? They're all in a 24/7 news cycle trying to make decisions about what to share and how to share it. And so, it makes it hard for individual journalists sometimes, and we see they get a lot of flack. But next week will be our last seminar. It's going to be a little bit less structured. We're going to look at some case studies and then have a bit more discussion to practice and think about all the things we've talked about. So thanks everybody for coming tonight.